So, Dr. Shikha Jain has an extensive portfolio on the cultural heritage of India that covers conservation, world heritage, and museum planning of 50 plus projects. Most of these are largely realized through her organization, Drona. As an international expert on world heritage, she has advised government organizations in Singapore, Malaysia, UAE, Myanmar, and the UNESCO offices at Jakarta, Indonesia, and Myanmar. She has further worked as a consultant to the UNESCO New Delhi and represented the Ministry of Culture, India, as a heritage expert on the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. She is the vice president of ICOFORD, ICOMOS, and advisory committee member of MSc UNESCO C2C Dehradun. May I now request Shikha ma'am to enlighten us with her talk, mapping of stone crafts and integrating with conservation and design practices. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Can you allow me to present?
I think now you can see the icon. Is it visible? Sure. Present now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you, Vibhuti and Ravi. That was a very interesting exchange, and I wish I could just join the dialogue right now, rather than give a presentation myself. But I think as per schedule, I have to talk about this. There were very interesting questions raised. In both the cases, the geological perspective and the Shastric perspective, that was mentioned by Mr. Kailash about the, Urvashi's question on IICD. And I hope with my presentation, some of these would come through. So, I'm thinking of this presentation not really as something that I want to present, but, continue with the dialogue and the queries that have been raised. And I would say in that sense, if you are looking at the geological perspective and the Shastric perspective, I would say mine is a practical perspective. And my presentation is divided into three sections. First, I'm showing how we understood the stone crafts in Rajasthan and complete mapping of the stone crafts. And I agree with what Urvashi just said, that there are enough, master crafts people still there. We do have the knowledge. We just need to work more at, managing that knowledge and training the younger ones into it. And what Ravi said, not every craftsperson from Rajasthan comes with a machine tool. Some of them are doing handcrafting also. So that, but we really need to work on those resources. So I'll start with the mapping of stone crafts in Rajasthan. I will then show some conservation works that we have done in stone, and also some of the design elements, traditional and contemporary, that we continue to use in stone using that knowledge. In terms of conservation also, there were discussions on minimal intervention and the patina. And being a conservation architect myself, I do have respect for the patina and for, minimal intervention. But I also feel that there are conditions where if it's a value-based conservation, you have to realize what the value is and what kind of reconstruction or reuse, especially linked to the stone craftspersonship, is required. Because personally, I feel it's not really the stone monument or the building that needs to be conserved, but the continued craftsmanship that is important for us to continue. So in that sense, some of my examples would reflect that, besides, of course, the minimal intervention approach, which is well accepted in conservation. But in that sense, I would say the Shastric perspective or the living heritage approach, where the craftsperson really feels most satisfied when he has reconstructed a new, idol or a sculpture as per the old one, which looks exactly, and nobody can distinguish. That is the pride of Indian craftspersonship. And that is what I respect, because I've learned a lot from, the stone crafts myself during my practice. So I'll start with the stone crafts mapping project that we did. It was a 4-year project resulting in 3 publications by the Center for Development of Stones, which I believe has a library, a starting library that Vibhuti was suggesting, and IICD together. And this was a 4-year project which had resulted in a guide, a manual, and a resource directory that listed all the craftspeople in Rajasthan across 9 different stone crafts cluster. Is everything clear in my presentation and I'm audible, I hope?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so continuing with the mapping, I mean, you can see the craft clusters that were mapped. Jaisalmer and Jodhpur, largely sandstone. Makrana, which was white marble. Then we have Jaipur region, limestone, gray colored. You have Dholpur and Sikandra, which is red sandstone, red and beige color sandstone. Jalore, which is the only granite region in Rajasthan. And then you have Pindwara, marble, and Udaipur, which is limestone as well as marble. So we looked at the quarry suppliers and interviewed about 100 plus stone craftspeople in these various clusters. And these 2 documents of guide and the manual were made where, the guide looked at the story of stone, the geology in each area, and, the history in Rajasthan of stone from historic structures, from the traditional text right till the contemporary use. Also, the stone craft clusters that are listed here, 9 of them, as I mentioned, and then looking at various, aspects in the manual, starting from the structural elements, architectural elements, finishes, and other landscape and interior elements. So it was the whole process meant understanding the whole industry chain, starting from the quarrier, processor, supplier, craftsperson, architect, conservationist, as well as, finally, what is the current scenario for stone? How can we promote stone crafts today, through training programs or through more use by people in architecture and personally, in their houses. This is a view, of the quarries that we covered. We had a huge team which was divided into various smaller groups of 5 number, and each one was surveying 1 cluster. And we had set interview formats for quarrier suppliers as well as stone craftspeople to gather the information that we needed. So we looked at the quarries and, which were using machine, which were, if you see the ones at the bottom, like sandstone in Jaisalmer is so soft, you can just use a favda to dig it out. So we could understand, the supply, the quarrying that was involved in this whole thing, and also how the suppliers and the processing was done at various levels in various quarries. I won't get into details of this. Because my focus is really the craftsperson, who really gave us all the knowledge, and we could record all the various architectural elements, structural elements, and how they were produced since long, and how we can still continue some of these. In the guide itself, we have looked at mapping each cluster. So we are looking at what kind of stone is there, and geological qualities of the stone itself, what kind of products are produced, and what kind of finishes are used, what kind of tools are used in each region. So we had this kind of guide, also looking at the history of stone in each area. I mean, though Rajasthan is supposedly one state, but because you saw the diverse clusters and the stone types, it's a different historical and even stylistic perspective that you see everywhere. The types of stones, and including, the processing, the products, and the issues that are faced in each case, the techniques that are used. And this is a glimpse of the products from Jaisalmer area. So the question really was how can we learn about stone crafts and the knowledge systems. And of course, we have 2 references today. One is we understand the details from historic architecture, which is plenty in case of Rajasthan in stone, and also learn from the master craftsperson, fortunately, which we do have few of them still in Rajasthan. So the guide also records what Vibhuti mentioned about the Shastric perspective, the 3 kinds of stones that are used. historically what were the structures like temples where these stones were used, and there are texts like Rajwallabh Mandan in case of Rajasthan and Mewar region, which was used primarily in Rajasthan and Gujarat, a 15th century text where such aspects are mentioned. And even there is a mention that what kind of, in the Agama Shastras also, that what kind of stone is used for which kind of deity, which I think Mr. Kailash has already elaborated a lot. But moving further into history, moving forward towards the Mughal period, we again find how stone buildings were constructed. And most of the Mughal architecture largely is again, by the Rajasthan craftspeople who were trained at that time. And you can see this from Akbarnama and Babarnama, the construction of a garden or the construction of the Agra fort, which is in red sandstone. And later on, of course, we have evidence with the British, Lutyens Delhi, entirely again made from stone from Rajasthan, as well as craftspeople from there. And of course, the post-independence India, where we continue to use stone, like in the Birla temples that we see today, or even the 20th century temples like this Vipassana Pagoda in Mumbai. And of course, there are more Birla temples across and everywhere. So it's good to see that there is continued use of stone. And I would agree with Vibhuti that, it is also thriving. I feel stone is thriving, and which is really good. And the craftspeople need to thrive too. So moving on to really the builders in stone, which are our craftspeople. This Mr. Liaquat Ali is one of the master craftsperson in Jaisalmer. I'm not sure whether he's there anymore, but when we were working on this, we had long interviews with him, and we could really understand, the thought process and the kind of the kind of intelligence that a craftsperson has, and the intensive knowledge that we need to now disseminate to the younger craftspeople who are just joining and copying most of the time. So who are the stone craftspeople today? Like what Ravi said, he was talking about the newly trained communities who sometimes don't know much. But then you also have the master craftsperson from several generations. And out of the 100 plus that we interviewed, we found that there are at least 6 or 7 who can really be considered as master craftspeople, and who can actually train the younger ones in the right manner. And if we look at the kind of, the segregation, the Stapati or Sutradhar, Mr. Kailash has already elaborated. He's, really the master builder for temples, still has the knowledge. In case of South, it is the Stapati. In case of North, you have the Sompura community from Gujarat, who still continue till today. And they have the inner knowledge, but today they also have proficiency in AutoCAD and preparing estimates. So we had a lot of interviews and also had workshops organized with some of the Sompuras. The sculptor or the Shilpkar, very knowledgeable. He's the one who himself goes to the quarry and picks the stone for a particular deity, because what was mentioned, whether it's male, female, or a particular kind which is required for that particular, god that he's going to carve, is the knowledge that the Shilpkar has. And that's how they select the particular murti, stone that they want to make. The stone carver or the Silawat or Sankarash, largely, that came up during the Mughal period. But I mean, these are the carvers who are, doing intricate carving, whether it's jali or in the beam, the pattern that has to be given. That's what you see in this particular picture in marble carving. The inlayer or the jadati, which is again, the inlay work, stone inlay work that came from the Agra monuments created by the Mughals. But then some of these communities also moved on to places like Udaipur, where you still find, Titri and Sukher as 2 stone clusters within the city of Udaipur, where you can see this stone inlay work that continues and is currently being used in a lot of heritage hotels and elsewhere. And of course, the basic stone mistri, who would be making your stone wall, who is still in plenty in case of Rajasthan. And then, of course, the polisher or the quarry workers who would just be doing the finishing at times or basic carrying of stone who are there. So this is, the gamut of workers in stone which currently exist even today in the stone industry in Rajasthan. And moving on to the manual that we mapped, we are looking at structural elements. So we documented each element in detail. I'm going to quickly go over these when I will just stop at the one on Jali, which we will show you in detail. And here we were looking at each element. Arch, what are the types as per construction method, cut stone, bracketed, cobbled, and then the types according to the form. Also the assembly, how it is assembled, the jointing in the form. And again, the jointing in the form also has that nar, mada, male, female, the dove and tail joint, that is the tongue and groove joint that is there. So those are the codified languages of the craftspeople that we learned while documenting this. And of course, the finished products that are there in each case. So similar, documentation for the beams. And this is much more elaborate in the manual. If you access that, you will find all. Some, very important aspects like the bracket itself. How do you make a single bracket, a double, 4 times, a corner bracket, and, the most complex one, which is 5 or on all sides. So this on the right side, you can see the fixing of a bracket, which has 5 extensions to it and how it is fixed. And this is an example. This was actually created by Mr. Nimish Patel for the Haveli in Amer in Jaipur, where you can see a demonstration on how the brackets, pieces are carved out. And these are 3 pieces that are then fitted in joints. And it just works very well as a 5-point bracket. And then according to construction, you have these cobbled brackets also. And we looked at the fixing details. How much does a bracket have to go inside to create, the support that is required? And in some cases, it's almost half the bracket. So you take the entire piece and you just carve on half of it, whereas the rest of the half goes inside the thick stone walls that you see in historic structures. These are examples of some columns. Again, the monolithic columns, how the assembled ones with jointing, or the simple masonry ones that you have. And the kind of jointing, again, that you see in these columns, or the variety that is there. And a roof, which is very complex. Of course, you have the plain roof, which is flat roof, which is called the tukri roof in case of Rajasthan. And then you have the stepped roof, which is the sort of dome created by corbelling. And you find it in a lot of historic structures in Rajasthan. I will show you one conservation that we have done in this. The domical roofs, cobbled roof, segmented roof, and these are, of course, the drawings that we created while looking at the sites and talking to the craftspeople. But this image would give you a clear idea. So you can see this is the cobbled roof, so it's a chhatri domical roof, but cobbled here. This is a ribbed one where you see, ribs joining each other to form the dome. And this is a segmented one where you see 2 segments coming up to make one chhatri. So there are so many variations. And this is another chhatri where you see some kind of corbelling, but there is a system that is going, in the laying of stones as they go up. And another example, which is a contemporary one, but from one of the workshops of the craftspeople that we visited. Similar variations in stone staircases, which are projected, and very interesting ones that you see, which could just be treads fixed like this. Or in the historic structures, of course, we find a great variation. The kind of walls we mapped, I will not get into details of this, but the rubble masonry, ashlar, and also locally what they were called, like the Talpai wall in Jodhpur, which is very typical on how they use the stone, And these are some examples. So here you can see one of the walls, which is sort of a talpai finish that comes at like a cladding here. And then going on to architectural elements, we looked at the various kind of jharokas, again, how this fixing of this particular detail is done, the variations that exist in Jali. I will get into the details later, but it just shows the variations that are possible, even in smaller details like plinth or coping, the kind of designs or carvings that you see, the railing patterns that are there, whether it's monolithic, assembled, or carved, latticed, various kinds that you see, both contemporary and traditional, because our whole scope was moving from the historic to the current practices. And these are some of the contemporary examples of railing, including Jali work also. And what you see right below on the right side is from the Gandhi Museum in 30 January Marg in New Delhi, where you just see these sandstone structures and very interestingly tied up with the stone elements that are vertical, and then just the horizontal rods there. The water spouts, so much variation in each detail. It's really saluting the craftspersonship that Rajasthan and India has. And then, of course, coming to the current practices, the use of stone, which is largely in finishes. And the main concern here was, that Rajasthan has a lot of stones, but now most of it is, not being used for the crafts that should be encouraged, and which is a very high-end product that is created, but it is being sort of overused or misused in finishes like floor or wall cladding, whereas it has potential for much more. So maybe use less of the stone, because there are environmental concerns with the quarries and stone making. I won't get into that. Even the craftspeople, how they suffer with diseases because of the way they work. But the whole point was to reduce the bulk use of stone, or only use it from the quarries where it is not appropriate for carving. And that kind of judicious selection is what is needed for our quarries, which are finishing now. So this is again showing various kind of finishes, surface finishes, which could also be hand and it could also be machine now. Again, the finishes on the cladding itself, you find a wide variation there in sandstones of various colors. I will just explain the Jali in a bit of detail and then move on to the practical applications of how we are using this knowledge today. So each element we've looked at, what is the origin and historic evolution? What is the process and product? What are the tools and techniques, and what are the applications? So this goes for all the elements that I just showed, from arch to all the other details. And I'm just showing it for the stone Jali itself. We find the earliest historical evidence, as a square Jali, basic square grid Jali in Rajasthan, which was the pattern that was used. And you will find it in the Chittor and Kumbhalgarh monuments that you see in the picture here. And sometimes a basic square of 9 by 9, as you see out here. And 9 by 9 was supposedly also a very auspicious square number that was used. And of course, with historical development and Mughal influence, it evolved, and then later on again with the British time, it changed. And the referred texts on Jali, I've just listed, the Rajvallabh, the Jal Kaumudi by Pandit Kundan Lal in Hindi. I think Vibhuti would be aware of that, and I think she's written a paper on Jali, which we were also referencing during this making of the manual and publications. So these are the listed, the Jal Vigyan, that means knowledge of the Jali. It's just, a book written just for that, or even the Jal Kaumudi. And you see the historic styles. This is, in Udaipur city palace itself, you see, which is, dating from 16th century to the 20th century. You see how the square grid is visible in the 16th century. And then, later with the intervention of the Mughals, you see more complex, this same grid is actually filled with a Jali, which is has more variations, the hexagonal, which was used in the Mughal Jalis. And then the bottom ones, you see the British period, how it's including the stained glass and, other sort of floral figures which were used at that time. So the Jali, if we really look at it, it can be formed by establishing a grid. The grid could be square, rectangle, pentagonal, hexagonal, or octagonal. And the first thing is selecting a basic module. So on the right, the blue things that you see are the various modules that come out of hexagonal, octagonal, or square, rectangular jali. And then you sort of repeat the module. And the most common versatile one that can give you maximum variation design is the hexagonal one, which is also called the Chemas. The basic principle is that you take the area where you want to make a jali. If it's a rectangular piece, mark the center, and then divide both sides according to the intricacy required. So you make that grid. You draw the arc using the grid as, depending on what kind of pattern is required. And then you complete this. And once you have this pattern, that is, if it's a master crafts person looking at this square jali, he could have, 10, 15, 20 patterns that he can evolve, or maybe more. But if it is not a master crafts person, if it's just a regularly trained person, he would not know anything beyond 1 or 2 patterns, and he may just trace that pattern rather than generating it. So this is what we learned, on how these master crafts people were actually evolving patterns just by using a grid, and those patterns were just in their mind, and there was a methodology to do it. And this is just the simple jali, but of course you see variations from different paths, Dholpur, Pindwara, Jaisalmer, and in white Makrana marble. So the same pattern you can see on different scale, and variations even in shape on the right side that you see. This is the mastercrafts person, Abdul Manan in Makrana, who's showing us how to make this particular jali. I don't have this on video mode, but there are YouTube links to Drona, our organization, who worked on this, and you could look at the whole video clipping about this, on how this finally, the jali is marked using a green leaf on the white marble, and then, marked all the, what I said, mark the borders, then, use the compass to make the pattern, the divider to make the grid, and then, mark the curves, and finally, carve out this particular jali. And of course, for carving, initially it was only hand carving that they used, but now they have a power tool that they use, and which is a concern, because the younger ones may use a power tool which would actually damage the pattern or not make it as perfect. So your final chiseling has to be done by hand, and that is what is important for hand carving in stone. This is just showing what kind of square grids, how many variations can it evolve. The rectangular grid, you can see, what it can give you on the right side. The hexagonal grid, which I mentioned, the Chemas or the Ilaicha, is the network that they make to create it. And learning Chemas requires minimum labor, and it offers maximum number of designs. So this is the one which was used maximum it was generated during the Mughal period, and you find, most of the patterns being in this kind of grid. But like I said, if it is a younger person, rather than making the Ilaicha in the methodology, there are 4 methods actually for making it. They may just make the grid, and just put a template on it. Which would actually be just like copying and pasting. And you can, again, if you need it at a different scale, you would make another template, and that's really not the right way. So one really needs to work and mark on it, like I showed the master crafts person who had taught us on how to do it. And this is a problem I faced, when I talked to Liaquat Ali in Jaisalmer. He was, just shocked. He said, I've got these young architects, or recently passed out architects who would come and who would give him an AutoCAD drawing with a pattern of jali, and they'll say, make it. And he said, you look at the drawing and they have no knowledge of, whether this can be made in stone or not. They are just, you're offsetting on AutoCAD, and you create a pattern that looks good on your screen, and you think it can be converted into a jali. So that is the, gap that we need to fill today, and really learn from such master crafts people. So hexagonal grid, again, look at the variety of patterns. It can be just jali, it can be filled like a relief work. There is, like I said, maximum variations possible in this one, and different modules that you can pick. And it's just so much fun looking at the designs that it can generate. The square grid we already talked about, and you can see how the square grid can combine with the octagon. So when the square and octagon combine, you can see variations like this where you both are there. And this is another example, Jali door in case of Jodhpur, a house in Jodhpur. That is one area you still see houses being constructed and stone really thriving there. So you can see the kind of Jali which combines both the square and the octagonal grid. And this is again the square and octagon, and you can see, how sophisticated this Jali is with the pattern that is almost like a wave. You would not even know that there is a square or octagon there because it's almost seems like a curve. And this, of course, is really supreme example. You can see the thinness of the Jali, and this is again like a mix of the two grids, but there is no way you can even decipher the complexity. In this complexity, it's difficult to decipher the grid that is originally there. But this is the beauty of stone craftspersonship in Rajasthan, I would say. And we documented the tools used in the Jali making, like we did for each of the artifacts that I was talking about, arch and beam and others. So in this case, of course, you can see the kind of tools. They used hand drilling and hand grinding machine. Like I said, this is where he's actually carving out. And that's where they need to know how much to carve, but they can't use it in the edges. Or should, if it's really an expert one, then they would just use the hand tools. So that is, where the balance is required, or the knowledge. You can use the hand tool because it is today the technology of the day, and it does allow, because you don't want the craftsperson to suffer and really keep cutting the stone, which could be easily cut like a big piece with a machine. But then you do want that craftsmanship to be retained. So one needs to know where a tool can be used and where you can only work with hand. And in our practice, then we had to actually get a lot of Jalis remade at times. When they were machine made, we just completely would reject it at times. And here you can see a person polishing the stone also. So this was a brief overview of the mapping. And of course, these publications are available. So you could, look at these, which have all the details. I'll move on to the conservation work that, really helped us. That the stone crafts knowledge really helped us with some of these conservation works. So I've taken some examples from our projects that are from various places. This is an example in the City Palace Museum in Udaipur, where we found one of the historic spaces which was not in use and was proposed to be converted into a museum gallery, and we were restoring this space. So we found that there are different Jalis in each ventilator and a different pattern. And in this case, you can easily see that the Jali, pattern is visible, so you can reconstruct that. But there was one Jali pattern, what you see out here on the left side, where the complete pattern was totally lost. And, we couldn't figure out what it was. And the local team there, looked at other Jalis, and finally they came up with what you see on the left side bottom here, which when we looked at it, I found that the pattern is not really, visible, and it may be a different one. And that's when we got onto the drawings, to the drawing board, looking at what is there. So we mapped this of whatever was remaining, and then we started generating from the center what pattern it could be, which is what you see on the right side. And finally, we could get this right side bottom, the Jali pattern, which was finally made and executed on the site. So it allowed us to understand what the original form was and actually replace it with something that is correct and as per a methodology that would be followed by the craftsperson person who made this Jali original. So here is where I would say, obviously retaining this original piece, which is almost gone, does not make sense. I can take it out and really put it in a, as a museum piece somewhere, or as a remain in one of the stores as a record of old one. But I do need to encourage the craftsperson who can create this Jali like this, and who is still living in Rajasthan today and needs to be encouraged. This is an example of, in the same palace, we see one of the galleries on the first floor where these jalis were completely covered with lime. So here, and this is the limestone, this region has a gray limestone and black stone from Chittor. These are the two kinds that are, and of course the white marble. So these are the three stone types visible here. And what you see is the gray limestone jali out here, which is actually because of the layers of lime that it had, we had to scrape it off to actually locate this jali. It was in the Zanana area. But after doing this, we also found that the stone was already flaking. And when the stone is weak and flaking, which is in this particular area in case of Mewar, and we've also found in other areas, then you do need something to bind and for it to live longer. And lime as a traditional material is what the craftspeople use. So that's why you see on the right side, this is, the lime araish work done by local craftspeople, again on the jali. So wherever we could expose the jali and the stone value was, the stone was not damaged or not flaking, we could retain it. But where it was actually already dying out, that's where it was strengthened using lime so that the pattern is retained, but it's still using the traditional techniques. This is a demonstration workshop organized by the Maharana Mewar Foundation at the City Palace Udaipur in 2017, where you can see, more advanced technology also being used. So you see the crack in this lintel and you see the store steel being put in. And today, of course, that's how we do the stitching in most cases. And it's actually not only today. I mean, even if you look at the Shastras, and there are shlokas that actually mention if a stone idol is broken, how you tie it with a gold piece or, a metal piece like that. So it's amazing, how similar principles are used even now. And that's what I think we need to look at scientifically at our Shastras and also integrate it in today's conservation practice. This is how the entrance looked for the City Palace. This was a metal road constructed sometimes in the 1980s when they needed a sewage line to go through. And it was really not leveled also properly. And this was actually redone. And all this stone that you see is the black Chittor stone, hand-carved stone ramp, which is, so there were so many workers, stone craftspeople who were working on this to create this entire ramp. Even in case of, spaces that have to be reused, like this particular museum courtyard that was identified, it was a staff parking earlier, and it was identified to be an orientation space. And new things like the stone furniture. So this is the local limestone, a pattern taken, from the building itself, but a contemporary design because it's a new area. But this is how it is being reused today. Again, promoting stone craftspersonship, which exists today, but, not with a copying kind of intention. And this is an inner area where you see the ashlar masonry and the cobbled white marble stone. And this is how it was cleaned and pointed and converted into this museum gallery. Similar aspects like in the Ghachki Guni, Jaipur, which is a street which has historic gardens. We worked on the lime masonry, the cleaning of the stone, as Ravi has already said, just with basic water and nylon brush or, cleaning it through, no chemicals, and making stone chhatris, consolidating them or reconstructing if it is required, because again, the chhatri making craftspeople are there. And if it is completely destroyed, then that's how, it's proposed in Rajasthan. Of course, there are, Ravi has already mentioned about the geological challenges. And one of the main projects where we faced it is this Jaisalmer Fort, which usually we think that it is made of sandstone. But if you really see the outcrop, of the hill on which it is a typical kind of limestone. There, though of course they have the soft sandstone which is used for carvings that I showed earlier. And in this particular case, the hill itself, the stone has this quality that it is very hard and strong, and that's what is used as the foundation of this entire fort, because that's what the hill is made of. But its weakness is that if it absorbs water, it sort of, crumbles or becomes like a swamp. And this particular fort it is a living fort. It has 3,000 people living there and historic havelis and houses, and that's how it's also recognized as a World Heritage Site. But the issue here was that in redoing the pipes, the new systems like water, providing water and sewage in the fort, the work that was done by the government in the 1995 year was sort of backfired, because a lot of water seepage came into the hill, and there were two structural faults because of which the stone wall gave way. And finally, it was a geological study done by World Monuments Fund, which could actually establish that it's because the water is being absorbed and the stone is crumbling. It's more like a swamp. That's why this wall is facing structural threat. And the entire sewage and drainage system was reworked. We were part of that team, and I was also part of the nomination of the fort later as a World Heritage now. But it's just what was emphasized earlier, that the geological knowledge for stone is very, very critical, for conservation works, especially in such sites. And it's, really Rajasthan is fortunate that even places like Jaipur are now recognized for its stone crafts, even by UNESCO, under the network of creative cities, as well as in the World Heritage listing. And this is the most recent project that we are doing. So now this is a stone cladding done in 1980s in the Baha'i House of Worship, New Delhi. And this is the stone that was transported from Italy. It is the same marble stone that was used in Parthenon and for the construction. And McGrath is the organization, the company from where it was sourced. So we are in touch with Mr. Sabah, the original architect. We are looking at the details of how this stone is deteriorating and what would be the material analysis and what kind of treatment it is required. And what we were told was, like, the Italian company who's provided the stone, they said they've never seen this kind of deterioration in stone anywhere else. And it's largely because of the Delhi environment and pollution that it is facing this issue here. So it's also to show you the range, that how stone conservation, it's not only limited to historic architecture, but if you even have the contemporary modern structures that require stone conservation today. And lastly, I'll touch upon the design elements that we have incorporated, because again, like I said, there are historic structures, cultural heritage, like you saw in that museum orientation space, where you need facilities and other elements to be introduced. And we try to encourage, use of stone craftsmanship in that. This is an example of the stone signage at the Jantar Mantar Jaipur, as well as, outside Hawa Mahal of Jaipur as a World Heritage City. This is an example of a project under Hirde on Ajmer lakefront at the Anasagar. You can see, the flooring as well as the wall on the side. And in Red Fort, there was a proposal that we did for Dalmia for the vision document in dialogue with ASI, where we were looking at what possible, ways stone can sort of sink in with the existing language of the fort. And this is the kind of stone furniture we propose, the dustbin and the benches, which are now installed in Red Fort. So they sort of merge with the character. But again, this is where we are trying to promote more of stone craftspersonship. And our most recent project that just got inaugurated on January 7th this year is this John Marshall Museum and Buddhist Theme Park in Sanchi, where we had, on the right, you see this is a British period historic structure that was existing, which we had to, clean up and conserve and convert into an interpretation center. But this park, which is spread in 17 acres and based on Buddhist theme, we also had to provide facilities. So we had to create another block just behind this. And this comes under the ASI protected World Heritage Zone, ASI buffer zone of Sanchi World Heritage Site. So we were clearly instructed by ASI that, whatever new structure is made should be really low profile and merge with the original one. And this is what you see. This is the existing historic one. The kind of stone signage we used here are very, for the suiting to the park, like very rough and not stylistic in that sense. But this is the facilities, the cafeteria structure, which is actually matching the existing one in a manner that you would not be able to distinguish, and it doesn't stand apart. Of course, when we were presenting to ASA and as well as to MP Tourism, our clients, we gave both options, that it could be modern, it could be completely contemporary, have its own language, or it could be like this. And this is another aspect that I would like to emphasize as, vis-a-vis Western and the Indian mind, that the Indian mind really likes, to stick to the conventional and the traditional and something that merges with the original, which I also mentioned, about the Indian craftsmen trying to make it as good as the original sculpture. So we need to understand this cultural mindset whenever we are doing conservation, and then decide, whether what should be right in that particular context. And for me, it's always the social aspect and giving employment and an encouraging craftsperson that becomes the decisive factor, as long as one is not disturbing the true value of a historic element. Definitely, you would not want to touch something that cannot be that is totally, needs to be protected and conserved as is, with minimal intervention. But this is the example of the new block that is constructed in stone. And you can see on the left side is the old one that exists, and on the right side, almost the same, getting the matching stone, getting them into the same size and creating. And actually, we were also surprised how you could not even make out the difference. But part of this, again, this was a wall inside the block that I was showing as to be proposed as interpretation center. It was completely covered with plaster. These arches were also not visible. Finally, we opened it, pointed, and used it for the display in the interpretation center, which incidentally is showing the history of stupa from mud to brick and stone later on. Those are the display that you see. And the park otherwise also, because it's on Buddhism and it talks about 4 noble truths through 4 kiosks. The first one is in black stone, showing dukkha, or the pains as the first noble truth. Moving on to gray, which is expressed with a gray stone pavilion, which is the desire, or the cause for pain. And then of course the last one, which is completely in white. But again, here you can see the paving pattern that a landscape expert came up with variations in stone. The signage that we used, even the seating around the trees was a swastika pattern or the star pattern, which were taken from Buddhism, philosophy of Buddhism, and the patterns used. And it ends in these 8 monoliths, which are stone, which has a lotus carved at different levels, and this is reflecting the 8-fold path as the end point. So this is my last slide, and this is from a project on the temples in Tamil Nadu, which has already been mentioned by one of the audience here. The kind of conservation work that is going on there is really something worrying, and we were put on that as a UNESCO mission to understand what is going wrong. And in doing that as a process, now we are doing a research project where we are looking at agamas and trying to interpret the agama shastras to create manuals for conservation that can be used today. And in that sense, like even the Tamil Nadu temple of, the College of Mammalpuram for the Sthapatis, we are, talking to them. But like Ravi has already said, there are very few people who really have the knowledge. And we found that the Sthapatis today may have knowledge of how to construct a new temple, but none of them have read the chapter on Jeernodhar or the regeneration or conservation as outlined in our traditional texts. And those are the chapters that we are interpreting right now. And this is an example from the temple of Madurai. You can see on the left, the stone carving, that is reflected of our stone craftsmanship historically. Whereas on the right, I mean, they were actually replacing right across, one set of columns, they were replacing with this new stone brought from Karnataka. And you can see the kind of carving all done in machine. And this is what, we really need to stop currently, understand what really is the original and how to transfer that stone crafts knowledge before it gets lost, to everyone and to use it in practice. Thank you. I hope I am in time.
Yeah, ma'am. Thanks a lot for a very, can say, structured and very comprehensive kind of presentation, which you started from. Like, I think you've covered a lot of topics, including the people who work on it, that kind of materials conservation, how it can be taken to contemporary. So, thanks a lot, ma'am, for a very detailed and very interesting presentation. So now I would like to open the room for questions which anyone might have, and then we'll take them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shika, for your presentation. I just would like to point to the larger context of our gathering today, which certainly Smriti already told you. So we started a year ago on a common inventory in an Indo-German project on experimental architecture and material culture, in which we actually followed your path, looking at the raw material, then at the fabrication process, architectural elements, and we started with mud and earth architecture in both India and Europe. Our second chapter is on stone, and now there are teams looking at quarries. There's a very interesting inventory on quarry in France with many samples of stones we used as a base for our endeavor. And in the end of 2020, we will come up with a publication. And I just would like to ask you if it's possible to share some of this material to make it accessible to a broader audience, also in Europe. And if you would give us the right to use it. I mean, it also applies to the other speakers of today. And I would really be pleased because many of your ideas were also part of the preparation of our work, especially the question of immaterial cultural heritage. We also discussed the example of Japan, where conservation means to conserve the person who still can produce wooden details and go on with this heritage. So this is also very much discussed in Europe, and it would be great to have perhaps a selection of cases which we could integrate in the database, out of which shall be published online work. Thank you again.
Yeah, sure. Most welcome. I'm happy to contribute.
If there isn't any question from others, I would like to say something on this, on yours. Is it all right, Dr. Shika Jain?
Yeah, please.
No, this was your presentation was fantastic, and in fact, I would say something because you had not only covered what is very practical, the empirical part of it. So as you mentioned, there's three people. I thought there could be some kind of a overlapping. There could be, without knowing it, but there's no overlapping. First of all, and then looking at the situation of the whole of India, even if there are three more people, three more experts, or six more experts, there may not be any overlapping because India is such a complex, and we have only covered one part. Some part of South India, West and Rajasthan. That is what is covered. Then still other part of South India and East is there, Central India is there, and the hills are left out, Northeast is there. So each one has its own what you call set of peculiar stone. For example, laterite of Orissa. That's entirely another material that you have to deal with. And when we haven't actually gone deep into the South's granite and granite structures, architecture, and the problems. What is very interesting about yours is you not only covered the practical aspect, but also the application part, the application in conservation. So by showing examples now how exactly this has been used, and taking out one element and concentrating on that, going into depth of it, jolly, for example. So that material, the stone is not the same. If it is a sandstone, it has its own set of problems. Marble has its own set of problems, and it has its own set of craftspersons involved in it. They have set of tools which they work on. You covered both, this marble as well as sandstone. Granite is an entirely different game together, rather than the masons, the kind of knowledge they have. Incidentally, it's very interesting also. And the so-called, what you call the scriptural base, or the code that they have, the text that they follow. In Gujarat and Rajasthan, I think it is one text that they follow. In South itself, there is not only one, but there are two. In Kerala, they say they call it Vastu Vidya. But in Tamil Nadu, they call it Vastu Shastra for larger temple architecture, and Agama Shastra is for the ritual part of it. Ritual part of it. So these are they still follow it. In fact, of all the whole of India, it is the Agama Shastras are strictly followed in South only. Not only in Tamil Nadu, but Kerala has its own set of Agama Shastra, which is very different from other South. So and then Orissa people, they follow again. There is a text that is, I don't know what they call it. And the central India could be a combination of these two. No, it's neither Dravidian nor Orissa nor marble-based Western architectural style. So they have their own set of texts and set of craftspersons, and there are the problems associated with and the procedures of excavating this material, quarrying this material, and working on it, and making buildings out of it, making various elements, building elements out of it, and the craftspersons associated with their experiences, their problems. Each one is very different, like that. You have started somewhere and gone all the way and ended the story. So that's very, very remarkable that way. So whereas other one, the first one, Mr. Ravi, he started talking about, actually he was concentrating on conservation and the scientific aspect of conservation, certain issues, certain problems, and how exactly these could be tackled, and in a scientific way. So that gave a very good foundation, very good perspective, on a rational perspective. This is what it is. Whereas the other one, what it required was a complementary view. That is what Vibhuti, she presented that, the theoretical, metaphysical, and the scriptural, spiritual base of that, which actually is involved in every region. This part, both are there. It's not entirely scientific. There's so much of tradition, so much of custom, so much of what you call the traditional, the text-based or code-based knowledge, which is still being continued there. So that is really remarkable, the way you went all along. So now it also, whereas Ravi, he mentioned, what could be done further, for further study, further research. What are the areas? He pointed out certain areas, which is very, very, very interesting. So there, these issues could be taken on this there. Whereas when Vibhuti presented the kind of a metaphysical base, a spiritual or shastric perspective on it, it's a broad base. But when you go regionally, this one gains more depth. It gains more details into this general outlook. So this is the outlook in which the details vary. Details are, that is why when you go to a temple in Kerala, what is followed there as a ritual is very different from what is followed in Tamil Nadu. These two, and which again is very much different from what is followed in the north or the west, or east. So that is the Agama Shastra, which the practice, the ritual practices that are followed. Incidentally, you mentioned about this one in Tamil Nadu temple, is in Madurai temple, the wrong practices. Unfortunately, there was one great master sculptor, Ganapati Sthapati, his own one, unfortunately. He established it. He was an authority. He wrote books. He started this college, Mahabalipuram College of Temple Architecture and Vastu Shastra. And he only trained, the initial batches of sculptors were trained by him, and temple architects were trained by him only. Maybe this college in recent years may have fallen on not on very good hands. So that's why the same tradition is not continued. Incidentally, there is another school which is also there in Tirupati. Tirupati, they are calling traditional school of temple architecture and the sculpture. That is also there. It is also training sculptors and temple architects in the traditional architectural practices based on the scriptural text. They have they have a curriculum. They have the text to follow. So it's unfortunate if at that particular point of time the person whom you talk to, if he didn't display much of knowledge, but they generally whoever I spoke to, they display. They don't. Of course, you may scientifically you may challenge some of the, because it is based on faith. A lot of things are based on your system of belief. No, what is that? This is what is to be followed if you have to construct a temple. On that basis only, even now, temples are being constructed, wherever it is. They have a particular thing. When you say symbols and elements which are used, it's all traditional elements. So, on the whole, when you put all these things together, on the whole, they provide, there's a kind of a 3 dimension. Each one provided a dimension. So he concentrated on starting with the focus on conservation and including certain issues, problems, and how do you tackle that, and what is scientific basis of it, and then the scriptural or spiritual basis, theoretical basis for the whole of it. Generalistic though, but it also shows us there are areas where you can go deeper into it. And then you provided what exactly is actually followed. It's remarkable. I just wanted to know how exactly, was it part of a kind of a project, a study project? No, because it must have taken a lot of labor, a lot of people to put up all those things that you have done, right from quarrying to finally, this various craft coming, how people work, what tools they use, and then finally document it and come up with documentation. It must have taken a lot of resources, a lot of time and manpower. Was it part of a?
Yeah, it was a 4-year project. We're mapping and interviewing everyone. And this entire project was commissioned by the government of Rajasthan Center for Development of Stones and the Indian Institute of Crafts and Design. So they had a, expression or organization was given the entire work, and that's how we worked on this.
I see. That remarkable work, because once it is there, now we know at least these manuals and guides and then directories on this. This is what we had in mind. But considering the extent of India, now when you go, we can also go outside India. So to come up with certain manuals on stone, and so stone is not only one kind of stone, so different kind of stone in different regions. So you've got directories will be different. So when you put together, this is one part of the puzzle, the entire mosaic you have provided. Then there are other parts which needed to be fitted in to get a complete picture of, to cover the whole of India and all kinds of stones and all kinds of crafts and the method of working and the problems. And one aspect is conservation. And but you have also, in addition to conservation, how exactly contemporary use of this stone in today's architectural practice, how it is done. That is also you have shown by examples. That's really very remarkable. It shows both the possibilities, and also the potential for further work in a way when you look at it. So there are things which could be done and completed to complete the work and make it holistic. And that's it. And I must thank all of you because I get an opportunity to listen to your presentation and then get an idea of I may have underestimated the enormity of and the complexity of this the stone, though it sounds a simple material and single material, but there is so much more to know, and more is also possible. So that idea I got only out of today's presentation. Thank you so much.
So if I may add, Center for Development of Stone has been conducting, and these manuals are perfect. I mean, they are also available at Center for Development of Stones. You can buy them. They are available online as well. No, Shikha? They're still available. And also, they have been conducting these in-field tours for architects, which are fantastic. You get to see the quarries, you get to see the craftspeople, and all of those, reading about it and experiencing are two different things. And they also do testing of stones. And it is only problem, I think, is that they are focusing on architects, practicing architects and conservation architects. But maybe we can make a bridge for institutes like IIT Roorkee, and we can invite them or the students once travel becomes a possibility. I have just shared with Smriti, there's going to be an online program as well to meet the stone, the quarry, as well as people who are in the trade. And you get to understand this. There is what my takeaway from it is, as Vibhuti said, the link between what was there in terms of our reverence for nature, which includes stones, and the way the market forces are working. There is where the gap is. And how we do mining today. So I was trying to think and reflect on it because I've been onto these field trips. And Vibhuti, I think it would be very interesting if you would also go on one of those trips to see actually how the two things relate. And if one could, because that's where the gaps are. And I don't know, when a block is taken out by machines and the way it's cut vertically or horizontally, and I mean, you have to see the mechanized way of bringing the stones out. No doubts, there is such a huge variety. But I'm feeling a bit lost, to be honest, in this, the gaps, and where does it become relevant in terms of going forward? How do you bring these, do they stay away in the two silos? We celebrate the intangible part of our understanding of our culture and leave on the practical work. And Shikha and I, we often talk about it, that how do you, I mean, there is a whole practical part which you can really relate with and get on with it and decode it, but this whole intangible part, and what is happening in the field, which is driven by maybe big hotels and not necessarily. I mean, it's a sacrilege to see stone being abused. And as Shikha did say, just one sentence of it, that using it as floors and using it as, I mean, what are we doing? And who's going to bridge this gap? Or who is going to raise these questions as to how do you bring about this sensitivity, and how do you look into the finite aspect and the mining issues and the open mines? You see them, and you don't want to use the stone ever because some of them hurt you. The holes that are there in the entire hill, I mean, Udaipur, just beyond. So there are many, many issues, and I think it would be I just felt that we shouldn't wrap up the whole story as if everything is good and it's brilliant and it's you feel good about it, but we need to raise those questions as well because nobody is raising those ones, and the market is not going to raise them. So maybe the strength of an IIT Roorkee taking up such a project is to actually ask these questions, the different questions, and then to perhaps come up with to bridge the gaps. At least we start thinking about it. Thanks. That's my two bit. Thanks a lot, Shikha. That was fantastic. Look at the
Thank you, ma'am. In fact, thanks for talking about CDOS. Actually, I have this small personal story, and I would really like to thank Shikha ma'am for taking out time today, despite, I mean, she has a very hectic schedule today. So, I got Drona educational grant from Drona, and I did internship with Shikha ma'am, and I was actually sent by Drona on one of the CDOS workshops and tours. And in fact, I don't know whether Poonam ma'am remembers this. That was the first time 10 years ago I met you personally during one of those workshops and conferences organized by CDOS. And we had one master's student, Janvi, who went for this Indo-German exchange last year, and she worked with Excel. So she also had a little collaboration with CDOS, and she mapped all the quarries of India. She was supposed to be here today, but because of some personal reasons, she's not here. So I take all your suggestions, and we'll try to do as much as possible. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Perhaps one attempt to answer Poonam's very political question, how to fill the gap or how to overcome the gap between the market forces and the consideration of traditional value systems and so on. I think there was a move towards sustainable construction, also digging out again elderly tradition on mud building and stone architecture. And of course, even the market force works with clients who ask for something. And there's a little hope, I think, then that you can change on the consumer side a bit of the value system in order to raise attention and the quest for something, for a different quality. So I wouldn't be too desperate about that.
Yeah, we can always hope. Thanks, Axel, for that. Not desperate, but I think we being the numbers, you see, the population, you cannot compare your situation with us. And our 1% of people, I mean, when people use marble or Jaisalmer in the terraces in Goa, where we have 3 meters of rain, it hurts me. I can't begin to tell you how it hurts me. Because that stone is not going to last more than 1 year, and it's going to pit it. And it's a huge distance, and it's a beautiful stone. So, but this whole exchange of understanding materials, I mean, let's not go there, but it's a good start to be here. And maybe on that level, perhaps a break and rethinking and looking at our priorities and climate change and SDGs. I'm hopeful someday it will make a difference somewhere. But I think it's important that young architects become aware that we do need to rethink, and there is a need for rethinking and not just looking at hotels, take that as a benchmark of good practices. I'm just proposing that because it's a college, it's a university. It's the thought process in the universities have to address this, because what are benchmarks for good practices? That is important. That's what I feel. But great.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. So actually, before Shikha ma'am leaves, I think we actually want to take a group photo. So it would be good if everyone over here could switch on their cameras for just just a minute so that we can actually take a photo. Okay, thank you. So I now call upon Professor Smriti Saraswat, Assistant Professor at Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee, who is also the person behind the organization of such a webinar today. She has many meritorious distinctions in her bag, including receiving the Drona Educational Grant, like she mentioned, initiating and establishing an MOU between IIT Roorkee and Aalto University in Finland, obtaining the research grant, A New Passage to India by DAD, Germany, in collaboration with Professor Axel Zova from Arvita University in Aachen, and winning the Bharat Vikas Award from the Institute of Self-Reliance in Bhubaneswar for her contribution in the field of architectural heritage, to name a few. May I now call upon Smriti ma'am to give the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks.
I think it's too embarrassing. There are stalwarts sitting here, so that introduction was not needed, and everybody must be exhausted now. So I'm just going to say a quick, heartfelt thank you. I truly thank all the experts, Shikha ma'am, Vibhuti ma'am, Ravi sir, for sparing so much time on a Sunday and then having such elaborate discussion with us and sharing their insights and experiences. I also thank Professor Shankar, who has been helping us during this project, Professor Zoa, who has joined us from Germany and has been sharing his insights as well. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the participants and experts and guests who are here, Poonam ma'am, Mekhla, and Madhuri, lots of other faculty members from Delhi, Rajasthan, all the students from IIT and Germany. And last but not the least, my team, Oshin, Raman, Shweta, Sandeep. Thank you, everyone. And thankfully, Excel has already put up that request that we would be looking forward to getting in touch with you regarding all your contributions with, all due credits and due mention of all the work that you have for past many decades. So I thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Smriti.
Thank you, Smriti, for bringing us all together. It was really a fascinating morning here. You are in the evening, but for me, it was a wonderful start into the day. Thank you to all of you.
Same here. See you all. Thank you so much. We'll send shortly the summary and all the other details, and we'll get back to you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Vibhuti ma'am. Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.